The village of Amma had always been a place where everyone knew each other's names, where children played freely in the cobblestone streets, and where the worst crime in recent memory had been Old Man Higgins stealing a loaf of bread from the baker's window when his arthritis kept him from working. It was the kind of place where the biggest event of the year was the harvest festival, and where the most exciting gossip revolved around who might have kissed whom behind the church after Sunday's service. That was why, when the stranger arrived, the entire village noticed. No one ever moved to Amma. People only ever left. The house she chose only made her presence more unsettling, a crumbling, ivy-choked cottage at the edge of the woods, a place that had stood empty for as long as anyone could remember. The villagers whispered that the last family who lived there had vanished in the dead of night, leaving behind half-eaten meals and unmade beds. Some said they'd fled dead, others swore something far darker had taken them. But no one had dared to speak of it openly, until now. From the moment she stepped into town, the dogs knew. It started with old Mrs. Pembroke's terrier, a usually docile creature that spent its days sleeping in sunbeams on the porch. When the woman walked past, the little dog erupted into a frenzy of snarling barks, its hackles raised like it had seen the devil himself. Then it was the miller's hounds, then the stray that lingered by the butcher's shop. Every canine in the village seemed to lose its mind at the sight of her. They would strain at their leashes, howling and snapping, their eyes wild with fear or fury. The woman never reacted. She just kept walking, her long black coat fluttering behind her like a shadow-given form. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. After all, what could they say? That their dogs didn't like her? It wasn't a crime to be unlikable. Elena Carter, the village schoolteacher, was the first to try and welcome her. Elena was the kind of woman who believed in kindness above all else, who couldn't bear the thought of someone being left alone in a place where community was everything. So one evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and painted the sky in shades of fire, she knocked on the stranger's door with a basket of fresh bread and preserves in hand. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a sliver of darkness within. The woman stood there, her face pale as moonlight, her eyes too dark, too still. She didn't speak. Elena's cheerful greeting died in her throat as those eyes locked onto hers, and for a heartbeat she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then the woman smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that stretched too wide, showing too many teeth. "Thank you," she said, her voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. She took the basket and closed the door without another word. Elena stood there, her skin prickling with goosebumps, before hurrying home, her heart pounding in her chest. That night, Elena's dog, a gentle golden retriever named Sam, refused to settle. He paced the house, whining low in his throat, his ears pinned back. When Elena went to bed, Sam planted himself at the foot of the stairs, growling softly at something only he could see. Exhausted, Elena eventually drifted off, only to jerk awake hours later to the sound of Sam's furious barking. She stumbled to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered out into the moonlit yard. There, at the edge of the trees, stood the neighbor. Motionless, staring directly at Elena's house. Sam's barks turned to snarls, his body trembling with rage. Elena's blood ran cold. The woman didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, watching, until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Then, as silently as she'd appeared, she turned and vanished into the woods. The next morning, Elena found something on her porch. A child's toy, a wooden doll, its painted smile chipped and faded. It lay in pieces, shredded as if by claws or teeth. And wrapped around it, like a grotesque ribbon, was a length of dark, matted fur. Sam sniffed at it once, then backed away, his tail tucked between his legs. Elena's hands shook as she picked it up. She recognized that doll. It belonged to little Sarah Higgins, who had gone missing 10 years ago. The last place she'd been seen was near the abandoned cottage. The cottage where the stranger now lived. The shredded doll left Elena with a gnawing dread she couldn't shake, its splintered pieces burning like guilt in her pocket as she walked through the village square the next morning. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked bread from the miller's oven, but the usual chatter of the townsfolk had dimmed to hushed murmurs. Eyes darted toward her, then away, as if she carried some invisible taint from her encounter with the stranger. At the butcher's stall, Mrs. Darrow clutched her shawl tighter and leaned in to whisper to the baker's wife, their voices low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. "It's just like before," Mrs. Darrow hissed, her knuckles widening around her basket. "The dogs, the silence, God help us, it's starting again." The baker's wife crossed herself, her lips moving in a silent prayer, and Elena's stomach twisted. She had heard fragments of the old stories, of course. Every child in Black Hollow grew up with half-whispered tales of the cottage at the wood's edge, of the family that had vanished without a trace. But those were just ghost stories, weren't they? Yet now, as she watched the villagers' faces tighten with fear, she realized the truth: the past wasn't buried. It had been waiting. Father Malcolm, the village priest, found her at the schoolhouse that afternoon. He was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that had seen too much, his cassock frayed at the edges like a man worn down by battles no one else could see. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "You went to her house," he said, his voice gravelly with something that might have been fear or fury. Elena nodded, her throat dry. The priest's jaw clenched. "The dogs bark for a reason, Elena. They always have." He stepped closer, the scent of incense and old paper clinging to him, and lowered his voice. "There are things in this world that wear human skin but don't belong to it. The dogs know. They see what we can't, what we refuse to." Elena wanted to laugh, to dismiss his words as the ramblings of an old man too steeped in superstition, but then she remembered the way Sam had growled, the way the neighbor had stood in the dark, unblinking. Father Malcolm's hand gripped her wrist, his fingers cold. "Stay away from that house," he whispered. "And pray she hasn't already chosen you." That night, Elena couldn't sleep. The wind howled through the trees like a living thing, rattling the shutters, and Sam paced the room, his ears twitching at every creak of the floorboards. Just past midnight, a sound cut through the storm, a high, keening wail that didn't belong to any animal Elena knew. Sam's head snapped up, a growl building in his chest. Heart pounding, Elena crept to the window and peered out. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, casting just enough light to see the figure moving through the village square. The neighbor. She carried a bucket in one hand, her movements slow and deliberate, her head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. Elena's breath fogged the glass as she watched the woman stop near the edge of the woods and set the bucket down. Then, from the shadows, the stray dogs came. They slunk forward, their tails low, their eyes gleaming in the dark. The neighbor reached into the bucket and pulled out a handful of something dark and glistening. "Meat." She tossed it to the dogs, and they fell upon it with a frenzy that made Elena's skin crawl. But then the moon shifted, and she saw it. The meat wasn't right. It was too red, too thick, and as the neighbor lifted another piece, Elena caught a glimpse of something pale and curved beneath the gore. A finger. The next morning, the village was eerily still. No children played in the square, no women gathered at the well. Even the birds were silent. Elena walked to the home of Agnes Whitmore, the oldest resident of Black Hollow, a woman who had been ancient even when Elena was a child. Agnes's cottage smelled of herbs and damp wool, the air thick with the weight of years. The old woman sat by the fire, her gnarled hands clutching a shawl around her shoulders, her milky eyes fixed on the flames. "You've seen her," Agnes said before Elena could speak. It wasn't a question. Elena nodded, and Agnes's breath hitched. "I'd hoped she'd never come back." Elena leaned forward. "Who is she?" Agnes's hands trembled. "Not who." "What?" She turned her head toward the window, where the first light of dawn was creeping over the trees. 60 years ago, a woman lived in that house. She had a daughter, beautiful, but strange. The dogs hated her even then. One night, the girl vanished, and the next morning, her mother was found dead in the cellar. Her heart had been ripped out. Agnes's voice dropped to a whisper. They said it was animals. But the dogs wouldn't go near the body. Elena's pulse thundered in her ears. "You think it's her? The daughter?" Agnes's eyes met hers, filled with a terror so deep it seemed to have worn grooves into her face. "I think she never left." Just then, a shadow passed the window. The neighbor stood outside, her face pressed almost to the glass, her smile stretching impossibly wide. Agnes gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Lillian!" she choked out. Then her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed, her body hitting the floor with a thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The chaos of Agnes Whitmore's collapse sent the village into a frenzy, with neighbors rushing to the old woman's cottage only to find her pale and trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she muttered the name, Lillian, over and over like a cursed incantation. Elena, her hands still shaking from the shock of seeing the neighbor's face pressed against the glass, that too wide smile, those unblinking eyes, knew she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. As the village healer tended to Agnes, Elena slipped away, her mind racing. If the neighbor truly was connected to the disappearances from decades ago, there had to be proof somewhere. The town archives, a dusty back room in the church filled with crumbling ledgers and yellowed photographs, seemed the best place to start. Father Malcolm had warned her to stay away, but the fear in Agnes's eyes had ignited something desperate in Elena, a need to understand what evil had slithered back into the village. The church was empty when she arrived, the scent of old wood and candle wax thick in the air as she pushed open the creaking door to the records room. Cobwebs clung to the shelves, and the floorboards groaned underfoot as she sifted through boxes labeled in faded ink. It was in a brittle, leather-bound ledger from 1923 that she found the first clue, a census entry for the cottage at the edge of the woods. The name, Lillian Graves, stared up at her in spidery script, listed as the daughter of Eleanor Graves, a widow. And then, tucked between the pages, a photograph. Elena's blood turned to ice. The image was sepia-toned, the edges frayed, but the face was unmistakable. A young woman with sharp features and dark, hollow eyes stood beside the cottage, her lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her gaze. It was the neighbor. Every detail, the slant of her cheekbones, the way her hands clasped in front of her, was identical. But the date scrawled on the back read June 12, 1923. 100 years ago. Elena's breath came fast, her fingers trembling as she flipped through more pages. Another entry, decades later, mentioned a child vanishing near the Graves property. Then another. And another. A pattern, a cycle, one that lined up with the shredded doll, with the whispers of the past. The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. Whatever Lillian was, she wasn't human. And she had been taking children for a very, very long time. The rain started that evening, a relentless downpour that turned the village roads to mud and the air to a damp, suffocating chill. Elena sat by her window, Sam whining at her feet, the photograph of Lillian burning a hole in her thoughts. Movement caught her eye, a figure standing in the middle of the square, drenched but perfectly still. The neighbor. Elena's pulse spiked as she watched the woman tilt her face to the sky, the rain sluicing over her skin, her clothes plastered to her body. But she didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't even seem to breathe. Minutes stretched into an hour, and still, the neighbor stood there, unbothered by the storm, as if she were waiting for something, or someone. Elena's skin prickled. This wasn't just odd behavior. It was something far worse. A predator's patience. Father Malcolm arrived at her door just after nightfall, his face drawn, his robes soaked through. He didn't wait for an invitation before stepping inside, his voice low and urgent. "You went to the archives." Elena didn't deny it. She showed him the photograph, and the priest's face paled. "God help us," he muttered, crossing himself. Then, in a voice heavy with dread, he told her the truth. The Graves women had never been ordinary. Eleanor Graves had dabbled in dark arts, trading her soul for power, and when her daughter Lillian fell ill, she made a bargain to save her. "Immortality," Father Malcolm whispered, "but at a cost. Every year, a life must be given. A child's soul, consumed to keep the curse at bay. The village's missing children, the shredded toys, the dog's hatred, it all made sense now. Lillian wasn't just a monster. She was a vessel, a hollow thing wearing a stolen face, forever hungry. Elena's stomach churned. Why hasn't anyone stopped her? The priest's eyes were haunted. We've tried. My predecessor, Father Byrne, performed an exorcism in 47. It failed. Lillian slit his throat and left his body on the altar. The words hung in the air, a grotesque promise of what awaited anyone who interfered. But Elena couldn't let it go. Not when the next victim could be one of her students. Not when Sam growled every time the wind rattled the trees. She had to do something, even if it meant facing Lillian herself. The next morning, Elena woke to silence. No birds, no distant chatter from the square. Just an oppressive stillness, as if the village itself was holding its breath. Then she saw it. On her doorstep, small and innocuous, a child's shoe. The leather was scuffed, the laces frayed, but it was the dark, rust-colored stain soaking the toe that made her knees buckle. Blood. Fresh enough to still smell. And tucked inside, a slip of paper with a single word in elegant, looping script, soon. Outside, the dogs began to howl. The blood-stained shoe left Elena paralyzed with terror, its grim message, soon, burning in her mind like a brand. She clutched the tiny shoe, her fingers trembling as the distant howls of the village dogs swelled into a cacophony of snarls and barks that seemed to shake the very walls of her cottage. Father Malcolm's warnings echoed in her skull, a child's soul, consumed to keep the curse at bay. There was no time left. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Elena and the priest crept toward the Graves cottage, their lanterns shuddered to mere slivers of light, their breaths shallow with fear. The woods loomed around them, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes in the dark, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The cottage itself was a silhouette of decay, its windows black and lifeless, until a flicker of movement caught Elena's eye. A dim, pulsating glow seeped from the basement, casting eerie shadows that writhed against the walls. The air smelled of copper and something older, something rotten. They crouched beneath the window, their hearts hammering, and peered inside. The scene was something out of a nightmare. Lillian stood in the center of the room, her back to them, her arms raised as if in prayer. Candles lined the floor, their flames unnaturally still despite the damp chill. And then, Elena stifled a scream. Lillian's hands gripped the sides of her face, her fingers digging into her own skin. With a wet, tearing sound, she began to peel. The flesh split like parchment, revealing not muscle or bone, but something blackened and twisted beneath, a thing of sinew and smoke. Her human face sloughed away, collapsing onto the floor in a grotesque heap, and what remained was a nightmare-given form, a skeletal figure with hollow eyes that burned like embers, its jaw unhinged in a silent scream. The stench of decay flooded the room, thick enough to taste. Elena gagged, her stomach heaving, but Father Malcolm's grip on her arm was iron tight. His lips moved in a silent prayer, his face ashen. Then the memories struck him like a blow. The priest's knees buckled as the vision overtook him, his ancestor, Father Byrne, standing in this very basement decades ago, his crucifix raised, his voice booming with holy fury as he confronted Lillian. She had been younger then, her disguise less refined, but the horror was the same. The exorcism had failed. The holy water sizzled against her skin like acid, but she had laughed, a sound like breaking glass, before lunging. The flash of a blade. The spray of blood across the altar. And then, the children. Dozens of them, their faces frozen in eternal terror, their souls trapped in the darkness behind Lillian's eyes. The priest's vision cleared with a gasp, and he knew Lillian wasn't just feeding on the children. She was collecting them, their stolen souls the fuel for her cursed immortality. Elena's resolve hardened. She couldn't let another child disappear. Not again. She motioned to Father Malcolm, now, and they burst through the door, the priest brandishing his crucifix, Elena clutching a vial of holy water snatched from the church. The thing that had been Lillian turned slowly, its ember eyes flaring. It smiled, its jagged teeth glinting in the candlelight. "You're too late," it rasped, its voice a chorus of whispers, the voices of the stolen children woven into its own. Outside, the howling reached a fever pitch. Then the door splintered open, and the dogs came. They poured into the room, their bodies rigid, their eyes glowing the same hellish red as Lillian's. The village strays, the miller's hounds, even sweet old Mrs. Pembroke's terrier, all twisted into snarling, slavering monsters. They circled Elena and the priest, their growls vibrating through the floorboards. Lillian's laughter rang out, high and maddening. "You see?" she crooned, stroking the head of the largest hound like a beloved pet. "The dogs always knew what I was. Now they serve me." The pack lunged. Elena and Father Malcolm fought back in a frenzy of desperation. Holy water sizzled against fur and fawn, the dogs yelping as it scalded their possessed flesh. The priest's crucifix struck one beast between the eyes, and it collapsed, whimpering, its eyes clearing for a fleeting second before the red light returned. But there were too many. Jaws snapped at Elena's heels, teeth tearing through her coat sleeve. She stumbled, her back hitting the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, a familiar whine. Sam. Her sweet, loyal Sam stood in the doorway, his golden fur bristling, his eyes locked onto hers. Relief flooded her. "Sam! Help!" The words died in her throat. Sam's eyes flickered, then ignited into the same hellish red. His lips peeled back in a snarl, his teeth bared not at Lillian, but at her. The betrayal cut deeper than any fawn. Her own dog, her protector, now advancing on her with murder in his gaze. Lillian's laughter swelled, filling the room, the house, the world. "Good boy," she purred. And Sam attacked. Sam lunged, his teeth flashing in the dim candlelight. But Elena barely managed to twist away in time, his snapping jaws grazing her shoulder instead of her throat. The pain barely registered. Her heart was too busy shattering at the sight of her beloved dog's glowing red eyes, his once gentle face now twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. Around her, the other dogs closed in, their growls vibrating through the floorboards, their drool splattering against the rotting wood. Father Malcolm staggered to her side, his crucifix raised high, his voice booming in a desperate prayer that made the candles flicker wildly. "Lillian, no!" The thing wearing Lillian's stolen face threw back its head and laughed, the sound like nails scraping against bone. "Your God has no power here, priest!" It sneered, its voice a grotesque blend of the witch's malice and the stolen voices of the children she'd consumed. Then Father Malcolm reached into his robes. His fingers closed around something Elena hadn't seen before, a tarnished silver locket, its surface etched with strange, looping symbols. "You're wrong," he gasped, his voice raw with defiance. "This belonged to Father Byrne. He died holding it. And it's soaked in the blood of a martyr." With a cry, he hurled the locket at the creature. It struck its chest with a sizzling hiss, like meat hitting a hot pan. The thing that had been Lillian screamed, a sound so piercing the basement walls trembled. Its stolen skin began to bubble and blacken, peeling away in chunks, revealing not the monstrous form they'd seen earlier, but something worse. A child. A small, fragile girl, no older than 8, her face pale and sunken, her eyes wide with terror. She clutched at her own throat as if something were choking her from the inside, her lips moving soundlessly. Elena's breath caught. She knew that face. It was the same one from the missing posters still tucked in the village archives. Sarah Higgins. The girl who had vanished 10 years ago. The girl whose shredded doll had been left on Elena's porch. She's still in there," Elena choked out, her hands flying to her mouth. The priest's face was grim. "Not for long. The witch's spirit is anchored to her. If we don't act now, she'll drag Sarah's soul into the abyss with her." The creature writhed, its form flickering between the little girl and the monstrous witch, its voice a warped duet of innocence and evil. "Kill me and you kill her too," it taunted, Sarah's face contorting into a grin too wicked for a child. What kind of teacher murders her own student? Elena's vision blurred with tears. This wasn't fair. This wasn't right. Somewhere beneath the horror, Sarah was still trapped, still screaming. She couldn't let her die. But if she didn't, more children would disappear. The weight of the choice crushed her. Father Malcolm made the decision for her. With a roar, he snatched up a candle and flung it at the rotting walls. The flames caught instantly, racing up the wood like living things. The creature shrieked, its form destabilizing further as the fire spread. "Run!" the priest bellowed, shoving Elena toward the stairs. She stumbled, her legs numb with terror, but not before grabbing Sam's collar, dragging her possessed dog with her. The last thing she saw before the smoke swallowed the basement was Sarah's face, free of the witch's grip for one fleeting second, her eyes clear, her mouth forming a single word: help. The cottage burned like a funeral pyre, its flames painting the night sky in shades of hell. The villagers gathered in horrified silence as the structure collapsed in on itself, the heat so intense no one dared approach. And then, a miracle. The dogs stopped howling. Their eyes cleared. Sam whined and licked Elena's soot-streaked face, his tail tentatively wagging, as if waking from a nightmare. The curse was broken. But in the ashes, amid the charred bones and melted trinkets, one item remained untouched: the locket. Elena picked it up with trembling fingers, its metal cold against her skin. When she pried it open, her blood turned to ice. Inside was a photograph, a fresh one, of her. And scrawled beneath it, in that same elegant script: next. The curse was never about the house. It was about the teacher all along.